Hi everyone, this is Soumyadeep Paul, a mentor at Code Cardos and a software developer at Amazon. And this is day 3 of our system design series. In the previous video of our system design series, we learned what are the three layers of a web application. Now today we'll be starting with what are architectures. Okay, so there are basically two types of architectures. Now, first is a monolithic architecture. Okay, a monolithic architecture. Now, before we jump into types of architecture, what exactly is an architecture? An architecture is a way in which you design your web application. Okay, so we'll see, don't worry, you'll understand this very clearly. Architectures, there are two types, monolithic and microservices. Okay. And both are very, very popular. And it depends. In some cases, you use a monolithic architecture. You follow a monolithic architecture. And in some cases, you follow a microservices architecture. Okay. So what is this? What is a monolithic architecture? What is a monolithic architecture? So if you remember that in our previous video, we learned the three layers of a web application. What were those three layers? The first one was the UI layer, also called as the front end layer, also called as the user layer, isn't it? Then the second one was the backend layer, also called as the business logic layer, also called as the server. And then the third layer, which was the database layer, also called as the data layer. Okay. So this is what it is. So monolithic architecture means when all the three layers of a web application, which is front end, back end, and data, which is what? Which is front end, which is back end, and data. Okay. All three layers of a web application are within the same code base. Okay, are within the same code base. And are also deployed together. In the same machine. In the same server or machine or whatever you want to call it. Okay. This is the definition. Okay. This is the definition of your monolithic architecture. Now you have your front end. Suppose you have written your front end code in normal HTML, CSS, or in React, or in React Native, or in Angular, whatever. Okay. Then you may have written your backend also maybe in JavaScript or MERN stack. Okay. Or Node.js. Then your database, it might be MongoDB. So whatever it is, this is your complete MERN stack. Whatever you have chosen to write front end, to write back end, to write the database, all of them are written in the same database. All of them are written in the same code base. Sorry, not database, but in the same code base. Okay, and they're also deployed together in the same machine. It is not the case that front end is deployed separately, back end is deployed separately in a separate server, and database is deployed separately in a separate server. That is not the case. If all of them are deployed together in a single server, in a single machine, then it is called as monolithic architecture. In your same repository, in your same code base, you have written the backend code, you have written the front end code, and you have written the data code. Okay. So if all of these three layers are written inside the same code base all together and also deployed together in the same machine all at once, then it is called as the monolithic architecture. Okay. Now, when do we actually use monolithic architecture? And see, most big applications, when you talk about Facebook or YouTube or Google Drive or any major big application, is not monolithic. Trust me, it's not monolithic. It is microservices architecture. But but each of those applications, I can assure you, each of those applications started as a monolithic architecture. So it is very important for you to understand what monolithic architecture is, because if you tomorrow have a brilliant idea and you want to start your entrepreneurial journey and you are a good developer as well, so you are coding your projects by yourself, then you also will be starting with a monolithic architecture. Okay. So great. So now let's see. When to use this monolithic architecture? When to use this monolithic architecture? Okay. When to use monolithic architecture? Let's see. The first one, when you're just starting out, isn't it? When you're just starting out. And as I just said, when you're just starting out. And as I just said that, no matter who you are, whether you're Elon Musk or you're Mark Zuckerberg, no matter how big the product is today, everyone started once with a monolithic architecture. Okay. So when you're starting out, you have a smaller team, you have a smaller code base, you have a smaller number of features. Things are pretty easy, simple, smooth. Not too much of things to maintain. Great, you start with a smaller code base. You start with just one machine. You don't have enough money to buy multiple machines, multiple servers for multiple deployments. So you just have a single code base, single repository, everything all at once, front end, back end, database all together. And then you deploy all of them together in a single machine. Okay. Then the second scenario is when you have a latency sensitive application. When you have a latency sensitive application. Latency sensitive application. Okay, when you have a latency sensitive application. Okay, when you have a latency sensitive application. Now, what does this mean here? Latency, matlab kya? What is latency? First, let us understand what is latency. Then we'll be understanding what is latency sensitive application. है ना? So latency means when you want things to be a bit faster. Latency simply means how long it takes for your server to respond. For your server to respond. Okay. So let's understand. So suppose here you have the UI, the front end. Okay, there is some user, there is some client. Then here you have the server. In the previous class, we also saw how the server, the backend, and the front end work in a request response cycle, isn't it? This is also called as the client. Okay. The client server architecture. The client server architecture. The client server architecture works on the basis of the request response cycle. Okay. On the basis of request response cycle. On the basis of request response cycle. Okay. So here, if your client wants some information, it will send a request to the server. So the request will take some time in reaching the server, isn't it? This will take, say, time T1. The server will do some processing. It will receive the request, maybe fetch some data from the request, then do some processing, fetch the data from the server, from the database. So it will take some T2 time in processing. and then send back the response in, and this response will need T3 time in reaching from the server to client. Okay, so what is T1? T1 is time taken for the request to reach the server. Okay. What is T2? T2 is the server's processing time. Okay. Now, obviously, if you're asking for some data, if you're requesting something to the server will be fulfilling that request. So to fulfill that request, it needs to do some processing, isn't it? Then what is T3? The time taken for the response to reach server. Okay, to reach server. The time taken for the response to reach server. Okay. So your latency is defined as T1 plus T3, which means the time it takes for the request to go to the server and the time it takes for the request to come back, response to come back from the server to the client. And there is also something called as response time. Okay. Response time is latency, which is T1 plus T3, plus the processing time, which is T2. Okay. So remember this concept. Latency and response time are often used interchangeably, but they're not same. Latency is different, response time is different. Okay. So yes, so every web application where you have a client separately, server separately, user separately, UI separately, front end separately, and the back end separately. So the front end and back end will then communicate through a request response cycle. And this request response cycle happens over the network, over the internet. This request response cycle happens over the internet. Okay, happens over the internet. But if you have a monolithic architecture, means your front end, back end, and database all are together. Then the front end and back end, since they're on the same machine, they can communicate through a process to process call, and they don't need a network call. Okay. In a monolithic architecture, front end and back end can communicate over the process to process call. Okay, process to process call. Since they're in the same machine, since they are in the same machine. Okay, understood. And don't need the request response cycle, and don't need the request response cycle. Okay. Okay. So since they don't need the request response cycle, they can directly communicate through process to process calls. Latency is almost zero. Therefore, latency is almost zero. That is why when you have a latency sensitive application, that you want latency to be as less as possible. It is very important. In such conditions, you use a monolithic architecture. Okay. And yeah, the third use case is also kind of when you're starting out, if you have a smaller team, or a smaller budget. Okay. Or I can kind of say the first scenario itself. When you're just starting out, you obviously would be having a smaller budget, a smaller team, etc. So I can say mainly these are the two conditions where you use a monolithic architecture. Either you're just starting out or you have a latency sensitive application. Okay. So I hope monolithic architecture is clear, that it is just a way of designing a web application where all your front end, back end, and database, all of them are together in the same code base and deployed in the same machine. So all these three different layers can communicate with each other. Front end can communicate with back end can communicate with front end can communicate with database can communicate with back end through process to process calls only, and they don't need over the network calls. Okay, so that's it for this video, and I'll see you all in the next video, which is day 4 for our system design series. And if you want to learn these concepts in a much more in-depth manner, and if you have some doubts, and if you directly want to learn from developers who work at big MNCs like Amazon, Google, Microsoft, then do join Code Cardos.